Welcome to the Project 9 video. You can find Project 9 on page 602, Programming Problem 1, the PET class. This is a very, very simple exercise in designing and utilizing a class. So let's take a look at the description here. Create a class named PET. It's similar to the one in the chapter, which has the following properties. Now remember that class objects contain methods and properties. Properties define it. It's like, you're an object, so you have a name, you have an age, you have a gender, you have height, weight, that sort of thing. Some of those can change, some of them can't. All right? Those are your properties. And in this case, we have name of the pet, the type of pet it is, dog, cat, bird, feline, canine, whatever, and the age of the pet. All right, so it says here, demonstrate the class in an application that creates an object of the class and lets the user enter the name, type, and age of his or her pet. This data should be stored in the object, all right? And then it retrieves the pet's name, type, age, properties, and displays the values on the screen. Well, they've given you a lot of latitude, but I would recommend you do something like I've done here. You just got a form with 3 text boxes on it. Text name, text type, text age. I got a save button. That's where we're going to do all of our activities. And then I have a label called label output on a form with the text set to a simple class. And of course, I have it set to center in the form. Okay. There we go. Now, obviously, you can double, since the default event handler for a button is click, you can just double click on it, but you can also go over here and set it in your event handler window. So let's look at what I've got here. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to add a class file or a class object to the solution. Now, mine's already here, okay? But I'm going to show you how to add it, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do to code it. So we've got to add a pet class object or class file, and then we're going to put code in it that's going to handle any kind of methods and properties. Now, there's not really going to be much in the way of methods here. This is mainly just a container to store data, but it will have the accessors and the default constructor. But just so you can remember here, in order to add a class to your project, come up here to your actual solution name, right-click on it, select Add New Item. Make sure that you have the correct language selected, which is C#, and here's your class object. And the name should be pet, all right, which I've already done there. And then you just click Add. So you type pet.cs. Oops. And then you just hit Add. I'm not doing that because I already have it over here, but that's what you would do. Okay, let's go back to the form. Code. Now, what I've already done here is I've already went through here and created my event handler for the button, which is right here, and I've got my regions in there. That's the default event handler for the button click event. Then I have a custom method over here called getPetData. Okay, so what it's going to do is, because what we're supposed to do is retrieve data from the object, we have to put data in the object, right? So it's going to grab all the text off of here, and it's going to store it in a new object we're going to create in here. And then in here, after we do that, we're just going to pull those data back out of there, which are the properties, name, age, and type. And then we're just going to populate that into the label on the form. Very straightforward. So basically, we're going to let the user type in the stuff. When they hit save, it's going to run the save event. We're going to create a pet object from that. And we're going to call this method here, getPetData. That's going to grab the data off of the form they just typed in, right, and store it in these properties. And at the very end, it's just going to pull that data back out of that pet object, and then it's going to just put it in the text property of this label. So there's really not a lot going on in that regard. Okay, so let's look at the pet object first. Let's go back to the pet. And we'll get started with the housekeeping type of things that you would normally do when you're creating a class like this. Okay, remember we had 3 properties in this pet object. They are name, type, and age. And if you remember from the chapter, you declare those as private because you don't want other parts of your program accidentally modifying these properties unless they are members specifically of the class. All right, that's how that works. So you set the access specifier to private on that. So we got 2 of type string and 1 of type integer. Notice they start with the underscore. That delineates that they are properties. It's just the way they do it. Now what we need to do is create a default constructor. Now what a constructor does, and you can have different ones with different arguments and so forth that do different things, but the default doesn't accept any arguments. So when you're creating the class in your code, and you've got like pet, uppercase parent, lowercase pet, or my pet, or whatever you call it, equals new pet, opening, closing paren, and I'll show you that code when we get into the button click. What that does is it fires the constructor that's associated with the number of arguments. It's method overloading. It was on one of the pages in the chapter. So you can have as many constructors as you want, and you can have as many overloaded methods as you want. They can use the same name. However, what the difference is, you have to make sure that they have different numbers and types of arguments. And I'm going to show you a little more than maybe what the book did on that in a minute. But let's go ahead and set up our default constructor. Okay, this is a constructor. Its access specifier is public, and it has the same name as the class. See, there's the class name pet, and it has opening, closing parens, which is just an argument list. It's empty. And then I've got my private string, my properties of the class. Notice they match. So what all this constructor is doing when you type the new operator when you're creating the class, what happens is when you use the new operator, when you're inheriting from the parent class, right, which we'll look at in button click, all it does is it looks up here and tries to find a copy of whatever. So if I had a custom constructor with 2 arguments in it, would look for that. But since we don't, it's going to look for this, and that's what we're going to call it after the new object. We'll just use the default constructor, and all it does is take these properties and sets them to default values, just to wipe them out so there's no garbage in there. Sort of like you do when you initialize a variable, right? It's the same idea. If you look at this, actually that is X is a child of the parent integer. It has all the methods and properties like toString and all that. It initializes it to 0. Well, that's what we're doing here. Same kind of a thing. You just didn't know you were doing class objects when you were doing those. All right, so we've got that. Now what? Well, we need a way to transfer these values here to these private properties up here. And you have to have accessors for that. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so here's our set of accessors. So if you're going to change the value of these properties, these class properties, name, type, and age, then you're going to have a special accessor for each one of those. It's sort of like a method in a way, but what it enables you to do is protect these private variables up here, yet get access to them, but you got to be a member of the class to do it. So there's the protection, okay? These are public, as is this constructor here. It's going to return a string, or it's going to receive a string. And notice they use the same name as the property, only it starts in the uppercase and doesn't have the underscore in front of it. All right, so you'll have one for name, one for type, and one for age. And of course, these 2 are of type string, as you can see, and this one is of type int. Now, these can be read, they can be write only, or read write, all right, which means you can actually get the values from them or set the value, write the value to the property. So these are all read write, so I have a get and a set. Some languages, they call these getters and setters, and that's what they do. So notice here that we're getting the property value, which is return statement, okay? That's we're going to return it back to the call or to the object. Or we're going to set them. So here you have the underscore name equals some value. These are keywords, return and value. Now, obviously, you've done return methods already. All right, so here's one for type, same kind of a thing. Here's one for age, same kind of a thing. All right, so That allows these constructors and any other method of the object to get access to these if you want them to have them, all right? To either get values already stored in there or set values right to these properties, all right? So that takes care of that. I believe we're okay there. All right, now let's go back to the form code. And what I have here is I've got my regions already set up, and I've already created a button click event. You can just double click on the save button to do that. Or you can go to your properties over there and do it. And this is my custom get data, right? So we already talked about these. I'm not going to get back into it too much. But let's go ahead and start with get pet data. All right, it's going to retrieve the values typed into those text boxes on the form. So let's see how that would work. Okay, as always, if you're writing to something or reading from something or opening a file or connecting to a database or going out to the internet or generating email, whatever you happen to be doing mathematical calculations, everything needs to be wrapped in a try-catch block, okay? You've already seen these. Now, this one is not very functional because it's just using a description of the EX message of the exception object. So this is the child of the exception object, which is the parent, and using the message box. And one of the methods of the exception object is message, or property, excuse me. And we use the dot operator for that. All right, so what this get pet data is going to receive is an object of type pet. So I'm going to create my pet object in here and use the new operator and call the default constructor, and you'll see how that works in a minute. Then I'm going to call this method passing in that child of the pet object that I'm going to create as an argument, which gives me, basically the pet object. So then I can type the name and the dot operator. And as you've seen, the dot operator, if it's a valid name on the left, will pull up IntelliSense and show you all the properties and methods associated with that object. So if I'm going over here and I type pet dot, that dot operator pulls up IntelliSense and shows me I've got the little wrench or your properties. I have an age property, a name property, and a type property. Now, I really don't have any custom methods in here, so these are just generic. There's toString, and there's several others that have to do with codes and so forth. If I had some methods in there, you would see them in the IntelliSense list. All righty. So essentially what I'm supposed to do here, now that I've got my pet object coming from my button save click event, I'm going to use the name dot operator, name equals, and then I'm going to grab the text out of the text box on the form. Text name, text type, text age. We have a little data validation going on here, since int age it's not string, it needs to be a numeric value. If they type in ABC123, that won't work. So basically we're taking the text.age and out as a read-only thing. We're going to look at that. Int try parse, if it's numeric, then it's fine. We'll go ahead and store it. If it's not, then we're going to pop up a little message box here that says invalid age, and you could even put set focus back to that text box, since that's where the error is if you wanted to. And that's basically it. There's not really a whole lot to this. Just remember that we already have a child object of type pet. There's the parent, there's the child. That's just no different than saying string X or int X in a method argument list. So there we have that, and we're grabbing that text for the name and sticking it in there, and we're grabbing the text for the type, sticking it in there, and grabbing the, assuming it's a numeric value, the age from the age text box, sticking it in there. And that's where we're getting it from right there. Okay. The argument's required by try parse. Okay, so now let's pull all this together and come down here to our click event, which is the save button. All right, so here is the one that's creating the child of type pet, right? There's our pet class right there. So we're saying create a child object of type pet, right? And so it's going to grab all the methods and properties from the parent that we defined in this .cs file up here. Use the new operator to bring it into life and call the constructor. That's the default constructor. Remember, there are no arguments in there. And I'm going to show you in a little bit how you can change that around if you want to. you might want to populate it from a database or somewhere. And how do you do that? Well, you can't wait on the user to type something. Well, I'll show you how that works. I don't connect or anything, but I'll just show you. Okay, so then we take this new MyPet object and we call this custom method up here, and we pass in our MyPet object of type pet. And that's why, just like if you had an argument list that looks something like this, I don't have that method, but if I did and it took length and width, I'd have to give it a type, length, comma, width. So it accepts 2 arguments, right? Well, this accepts 1 argument of type pet. This accepts 2 arguments of type integer. So you've been doing this all along. You might not have realized it. Right? Okay. So, so we call that. We've already gone through what this does. And now we need to output it. Get pet data just gets the stuff out of the data out of the text boxes and attaches them into the properties of the pet object, which is what we're doing here, right? Now it's simply just a very simple thing. We just need to go back and output all that stuff into our label. So let's take a look at that. Okay, well, how do we output it? Well, basically, we've got our pet object here that we just created and populated. So now I'm just going to do label output dot text equals, and I'm going to have some concatenated strings in here with some new line characters. That's what this is. This is an escape character for a new line. So we got name, colon, space, plus is your concatenation operation, and it says mypet.name. Remember the dot operator gives you IntelliSense and gives you all these properties. We only have 3. They're .name, .type, and .age. Now guess what? Those are the accessor names, not the actual property names, because you can't have access to that unless you go through those accessors. And then let's go back and look at that real quick. See, these are your accessors right here. Name, type, and age. It goes through and gets the values already stored there, right? See that? Once you get used to this, it's not bad. It's pretty cool, actually. All right, and so this is type string, this is type string. Well, these are all strings, which is the data type of the text property, right? So I have to convert this to string and then throw it in there. So, all right, let's save everything and run it and see what happens. Cross your fingers. Oh, I have avast happening here. Bear with me just a minute. Okay, I had to turn off my antivirus. Let's try this again and see what we get. Anytime now. There we go. Okay, so here's my form. Name I'm going to call Scamp. I used to have a cat named Scamp. He was a feline or a cat. Put cat in there. And I think he died at 15 years old. All right, so click Save. And there, it pulled it from, and we're going to put some breakpoints in here in a minute. It pulled it from the class object in the button click event and then populated it into the label. So let's put some breakpoints in here. See what's going on. Let me go in here and put a breakpoint, see if I can get it to break right here. That's my constructor in my pet class. And this one. All right, so let's run it again. F5. Okay, Scamp. Cat. 15. Okay, now it should be right here. It should jump over to the pet class and run that constructor. Let's see if it does. It did. There's my constructor in my pet class. It's going to basically just create default values as you saw. Now let's press F10. It's going to jump up here, hopefully. Oh, it didn't. Sorry. I didn't put a breakpoint up there. But it basically just grabbed the stuff that the user typed in there. Oops. And so it populated that. Now it's just going to concatenate all this stuff into the output. Press F5 at some point. What world is going on here? There it goes. All right, it popped back up and it outputted it. All right, so enough of that. Now let's talk about creating a custom constructor. Hopefully you've got a handle on all of that. All right. Okay, so here is my custom constructor. Now, notice they have the same name. This is an overloaded method, basically, is what it is. I can have different ones with the same name. The only caveat to this is you have to have different number and or types of arguments in the list. I could have one with 4 strings and still call it pet. So what it's going to do, it's going to look up the constructor when you create the object. It's going to look up the number of arguments in the list, and it's going to call whichever one of these constructors or methods that you have that matches it. So it's pretty cool, really. All right, so this one I'm going to go ahead and populate, give it some basic information, and then we'll overwrite that with the call to get pet data. All right, so basically it's the same thing here, except instead of using default like null, strings, and a 0, it's accepting 3 arguments, 2 of type string, 3 of type string. So I'm doing that with string. 2int32. Okay, so that's basically all I'm doing. I'm passing out a name, a type, and an age, and I'm converting it to an integer and sticking it in that property, okay, which is up here. All right, so let's go back to the code here. And how's this different? Let's see how it's. Okay, so here's my initialization and where I'm creating the class. So it's the same as this, except I'm calling that custom constructor. It takes 3 arguments of type string. See that? So there's no need to call get pet data in this case, unless I want to do some validation, which I don't really care in this case. It's not germane to what I'm trying to show you. I'm calling a default constructor that I created myself. Excuse me, a custom constructor that I created myself. And I'm passing in the data from the text boxes. So it's basically going to do this, populate the class, and then grab all the data out of it and stick it back in there. So let's see if this is going to work. All right, scamp cat age of 15. There you go. Now let me put some breakpoints and show you what's going on here. All right, there's that one. Let's go into the pet CS file and let's put this here. Yeah, there they are. So we're setting and getting, just like we did before, only I've got this line of code right here instead of all this. It's doing the same thing. It's grabbing the text out. I don't have to worry about trying to catch an exception. This is just a very simple example. So let's run this with the breakpoints that we get. Scamp cat 15. All right, so when we click the button, obviously it's going to break right here and hopefully jump over to the pet class and show how that custom constructor is going to run. All right, so this is basically I'm saying create a child of my pet, call my pet of type pet, use the new operator and call this custom constructor into which I'm passing the values that I just typed in from those text boxes. All right, so let's go to F5. All right, see it jumped over to the breakpoint that I had in the class object. Notice it's not running the custom constructor. Excuse me, it's not running the default constructor. It's running the custom constructor. It looked at that arguments list, and this is overloaded methods basically. It matched up what I had based on the arguments list, not just the name, because you can reuse the same name. All right, so let's do F10, step through all this. Okay, so now it's going to jump down there and populate the output. And there it is. Okay, pretty straightforward. I hope that makes some sense. You need to watch it a couple of times until you get a handle on it, but that's how all that works. See you at the next video.